In the early 2000s, Formula One pushed their V10 engines all the way to 20,000 RPM, making some of the most iconic engines of all time. But Japanese manufacturers had actually achieved the near 20,000 RPM redline long before, except not for race cars, but for street legal sport bikes. During the 80s, motorcycles were a very popular choice for transportation in Japan, and the fierce competition between Honda, Kawasaki, Suzuki, and Yamaha put Japan at the forefront of motorcycle engineering. And this perfectly overlapped with Japan's exploding street racing culture, and the cheap performance of sport bikes made them a very promising option for many enthusiasts. During this time, Japan utilized 3 different types of motorcycle licenses. The first would limit you to 125cc or less, the second would limit you to 400cc or less, and the final license would allow you to ride any motorcycle including those over 400cc. Now, this final unlimited license was very difficult to obtain, and for the average rider, there was no need for a motorcycle over 400cc, so the sub 400cc motorcycle category became very popular. So with a 400cc licensing limit, it makes sense for Japanese manufacturers to make 400cc sport bikes, but they also made 250s, and you might be wondering why would they do this if people could just ride the 400s with that license. And there's 2 main reasons for this. First is that in motorcycle racing, the 250cc class was one of the main classes in many events, but the bigger reason was that Japan had a law which exempt motorcycles under 250cc from having to pass inspection, which meant that manufacturers had more room to make the bikes the way they wanted, and enthusiasts had more room to modify their bikes without making them illegal to ride on the street. And because of this, there had already been street legal 250cc race bikes in production long before, with some interesting models like Yamaha's RD250 and Suzuki's RG250 Gamma, which both featured a 250cc 2-stroke parallel twin engine. But in 1984, Yamaha changed the 250cc game when they released their new 4-stroke inline 4 known as the Phaser 250, which was the first of these high-revving 250cc 4-cylinders, making roughly 45 horsepower, which was the legal power limit for a 250cc motorcycle in Japan. 2 years later, the Phaser 250 would get phased out by the new FZR 250 alongside Honda's new CBR 254. 1 year after that, Suzuki released the 1987 Gixxer 250. And finally, in 1989, Kawasaki joined with their new 250cc inline 4 sport bike known as the ZXR 250. All these bikes featured high redlines and roughly 45 horsepower as per the limit, but the best was yet to come. In 1990, Honda released the iconic CBR 250RR MC22, which redlined all the way up at an unbelievable 19,000 RPM. Now, some of you may be wondering how these bikes were able to rev so high, and this primarily comes down to just having smaller parts. It's the same reason that a regular 2-liter inline 4 that comes on a basic commuter car usually redlines just above 6,000 RPM, while an inline 4 engine on a sport bike redlines around 13,000 to 14,000 RPM. And when you scale the engine down even more to a 250cc, you have very small parts, which allow for those near 20,000 RPM redlines. But to reach these engine speeds more reliably, Honda used gear-driven cams as opposed to a regular timing chain setup, which allowed for more precise timing and helped ease maintenance, because these engines would spend much of their lifespan above 10,000 RPM, which would put a lot of wear and tear on a traditional timing chain setup. But despite these bikes making huge technological strides, by the mid-90s they were no longer sold in most parts of the world, although some of them were still available in Australia all the way until 2000. And for a while, I wondered why these manufacturers would discontinue making these insanely high revving baby inline 4s. And it comes down to a few factors. One of the main ones is that this bike could only be targeted to a very niche audience these days, since a tiny inline 4 engine doesn't make much torque, and you need to wring the bike out to quite high RPM just for day-to-day riding, which is quite impractical. Especially since most people buying lower cc bikes these days are beginners, and a parallel twin or even a single cylinder is a much more friendly and approachable setup for a low cc beginner bike. Another thing is, while it hasn't died out completely, the 250cc racing class isn't nearly as popular these days, so many people in the sport bike market will opt for a middleweight super sport or even a liter bike. But it's still a little unfortunate that we really have nothing quite like this today. This era was similar to the few years where Japanese manufacturers experimented with turbo sport bikes. It was just another time when the big 4 Japanese manufacturers experimented with different ways to make their motorcycles more competitive. And part of experimenting with new technology is that not everything's going to work out for any number of reasons. But this experimentation is part of the reason why Japanese-made sport bikes have become so perfected. They know what works because they've tried everything that hasn't. And part of that was pushing tiny 4-cylinder engines close to 20,000 RPM.